We begin the day with the U.S. president, the Israeli prime minister, and the Iranian nuclear threat. When the leaders of the U.S. and Israel get together, you can count on an abundance of affection. Lots of talk about shared values, mention the threat of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, and that is where this friendship begins to show some fissures. In their one-to-one talks earlier today, U.S. President Biden urged Israeli Prime Minister Lapid to join other Middle East nations in a united front against Iran. Analysts say that Tehran is rapidly approaching completion of a nuclear weapon. Now, to ensure that never happens, Lapid made it clear that Israel reserves the right to use military force first. And this is where you see a divergence in Israel and America's common course. Biden insists that efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal must first be exhausted. Diplomacy, he says, must be given another chance.
Today, you and I also discussed America's commitment to ensuring Iran never obtains a nuclear weapon. This is a vital security interest to both Israel and the United States, and I would add, for the rest of the world as well. I continue to believe that diplomacy is the best way to achieve this outcome, and will continue to work with Israel to counter other threats from Iran throughout the region, including support for terrorism, ballistic missile program that continues, and the proliferation of weapons to terrorists and proxies like Hezbollah.
Words will not stop them, Mr. President. Diplomacy will not stop them. The only thing that will stop Iran is knowing that if they continue to develop their nuclear program, the free world will use force. The only way to stop them is to put a credible military threat on the table.
Well, my first guest tonight is a former U.S. ambassador to Israel. He also served on the National Security Council during the Obama administration. He is now a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Dan Shapiro is with us tonight. Ambassador, it's good to have you with us. President Biden, he has not given up yet on reviving the Iran nuclear deal. We know that Israel has always opposed this deal. How important is this, I'm calling it a fissure, between Israel and the United States? How important is it?
There's nothing new about this disagreement between the United States and Israel, who agree completely, and it was restated today, that Iran must never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. So the importance, the fact that Iran is a threat to Israel, to other U.S. partners in the region, and of course to the U.S. itself, is not in disagreement at all. But the question of whether this agreement is the right decision, the means by which we pursue that objective of preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon, there's often been disagreements through multiple administrations. What is happening now, though, is that these talks, which have been essentially on life support now for many months, are reaching an inflection point. Either they will collapse in the very near future, and if that's the case, Iran will be left as a nuclear threshold state. They've basically achieved that status with their uranium enrichment program. Or the deal will be restored, and it will buy some time, 6, 7, 8 years before Iran could have that capability. But it will also provide Iran sanctions relief revenues that it could use to plow any of its other aggressive actions in the region. Either way, there needs to be a very serious consultation between the United States and its regional partners, chiefly Israel, and on what the strategy will be. So actually, it's a very good time for President Biden to go and talk with his Israeli colleagues, even though there is a disagreement. The strategy that they need to pursue going forward needs to be one that's conceived together.
And Ambassador, based on what you've experienced, what you've seen and heard, do you think that there is any chance of rescuing the JCPOA?
I think it's not dead yet. Neither side has an incentive at this point to declare those talks dead. But I do think it's on life support. It's been since about February that the essential contours of a deal to return to mutual compliance have been on the table. The United States and Iran, through the indirect negotiations coordinated by the EU, have essentially understand what that would look like. And the Iranians have continued to seek additional concessions outside the contours of the JCPOA. They focused for several months on this question of whether the IRGC should be removed from the foreign terrorist organizations list. And President Biden has made clear that's not going to happen just as a throw-in to this deal, not without some significant change in Iranian behavior of supporting terrorism. So at the moment, it doesn't look that likely, but I don't rule out that the Iranians could decide, given the economic crisis they face, that they really do want the sanctions relief that the deal promises. That they've certainly marketed that to their own people as something they could deliver. I think we will know in the next 2 to 3 months, maybe a little bit longer, whether these talks have any life left in them or not.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about Iran supporting terrorism in just a moment, but let me just ask you, how worried are you, or how worried are they, in your opinion, inside the White House that the JCPOA could be torpedoed by a unilateral move by Israel against Iran?
Well, Israel is a sovereign nation and obviously is able to act in its own self-defense. Nobody, I think, in the Biden administration undercuts that understanding of the Israeli sovereignty. And indeed, at least if one goes by what is reported in much of the international media, there have already been Israeli-sponsored strikes of different kinds or covert actions of different kinds inside Iran. And I certainly haven't detected from the outside any restraint imposed on Israel by the United States in that regard. It may even be a way of putting additional pressure and leverage on Iran during those negotiations. Now, a full-scale strike against nuclear facilities, that's maybe a different story. It's the kind of thing one hopes that two close partners like the United States and Israel would talk about, would coordinate about. But those discussions must be held extremely closely. I suspect some of them have happened over the last 24 hours. And, you know, it's always better when we're coordinated. But obviously, Israel will have to make its own decisions as it assesses its security.
In late June, 30 countries took part in a U.S.-led meeting on countering Hezbollah. I know that the Biden administration is worried that Hezbollah is trying to sabotage efforts to broker a deal over a maritime border dispute between Israel and Lebanon. Now, Hezbollah's leader is even making threats. I want you to take a listen to what the leader said.
If you don't give us what Lebanon and Hezbollah demand, if you don't allow companies to extract the oil we all want, God knows what will happen here. We might flip the table on everyone.
Ambassador, Israel says that it has already shot down 3 Hezbollah drones that were headed towards that gas rig in the Mediterranean. Talk to me about efforts to stop Hezbollah. I mean, this is an area in which Israel, the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and the wider Gulf and Middle East countries, they're all coming together because of this, aren't they?
Well, it's no question that Israel has many partners in the Arab world. Certainly those Gulf states, and many of them did participate in this recent meeting on a counter-Hezbollah strategy. Egypt, Jordan, many other moderate states in the region who see Hezbollah as exactly what they are. They are a Lebanese organization, but they are also an Iranian proxy, an Iranian agent. And Iran, through Hezbollah, A, tries to control Lebanon, and B, tries to project threats against Israel. Hezbollah is even involved in some other conflicts in Iraq and Yemen and elsewhere. But this Hezbollah activity related to the offshore gas deposits is really insane. And it really is a great example of how Hezbollah, perhaps under Iran's influence, has really cost the Lebanese people an enormous opportunity. And it's doing great damage to Lebanon's own well-being. Israel is already exploiting gas resources in its territorial waters that there's no dispute about. Those drones you described, you mentioned that the Israelis recently shot down, were headed for Israeli gas operations in completely undisputed waters. And it's all because of a small area of dispute. And there's a legitimate negotiation that has to be conducted to decide exactly where to draw the boundary. But until that boundary is drawn, and until Hezbollah, of course, ceases any threats of violence in that area, there are no companies that are going to invest in Lebanon's undisputed gas resources. So it's done great damage to Lebanon's own energy self-sufficiency and own economic prospects. Meanwhile, Israel is prospering with what they have been able to develop in their gas resources. So I hope that there will be pressure put on Hezbollah from internally from within Lebanon to allow Lebanon and Israel to reach a border agreement and then allow both countries to exploit their gas resources.
If you were advising President Biden ahead of his visit tomorrow to Saudi Arabia, knowing that he has vowed to make the kingdom a pariah, knowing that he now says he wants to reorient, not rupture the relationship, what would be your advice?
He's said that from the beginning. You know, he was, of course, very critical of Saudi Arabia and of the Crown Prince because of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, because of some aspects of the Saudi conduct of the war in Yemen. And at the same time, he recognized that Saudi Arabia faced real threats from Yemen, Iranian-sponsored proxy there, the Houthi, who have fired hundreds of missiles at civilian targets in Saudi Arabia. And he has always said he did not want to rupture. He wanted to recalibrate the relationship. And I think that's actually what he's doing. Now, I think the main impetus to do the visit now is really about the war in Ukraine and the fact that to lead an international coalition to push back on Russia's invasion of Ukraine requires a functional U.S.-Saudi relationship. In that relationship, the United States provides assurances for Saudi Arabia's security. That's a historic role the United States has always played. And Saudi Arabia commits to align itself with U.S. interests, especially when they're challenged by our global rivals, Russia and China. And in this context, that means more Saudi oil production to bring down prices, increase the bite of sanctions against Russia, and make more non-Russian energy supplies available to European markets. If that core bargain of the U.S.-Saudi relationship is restored, and has stabilized, that actually is a recalibration that then in some ways makes it easier to make progress on other issues that are still problematic in the relationship, human rights, the war in Yemen, and trying to promote Saudi normalization with Israel.
Before we run out of time, Ambassador, I want to talk a moment about elections. In November, we've got midterm elections in the U.S., we've got parliamentary elections in Israel. What can Biden take home to his domestic audience? What can Lapid present to Israelis after this visit?
Well, you know, I don't think presidents go overseas to score a lot of points politically at home. There's not always a lot of upside to the time spent overseas, especially when in the United States there's so much focus on domestic challenges, from inflationary pressures to gun violence to the ruling by the Supreme Court on abortion rights, to just the very deep split in American society that's represented by the January 6th insurrection and now the hearings in the Congress on that. So I'm not sure that President Biden scores a lot of points. Obviously, there are some constituencies that will be happy to see him recommit his longstanding commitment to Israel and its security. I think he does demonstrate good global leadership, especially on the crisis of the moment, which is the war in Ukraine, by engaging with the Gulf countries. So there's something that he can bring home. But, you know, at the end of the day, elections in the United States will be decided based on how people feel about their lives, their pocketbooks, their safety. And I think that's really what the focus will be. Prime Minister Lapid is an acting prime minister. He's also running, of course, in this election in November. It's hard to know, and I think President Biden has played it very straight, just simply dealing with him as the current prime minister. He also had a meeting with the opposition leader, who he knows, former Prime Minister Netanyahu. But I think it can't hurt Prime Minister Lapid to demonstrate to the Israeli public that he is fully capable and prepared and of conducting Israel's international relationships, including its most important relationship with the United States. That's obviously something that the Israeli public can now see him in that role in a way they haven't seen before. But it's so far from the actual voting in the Israeli election, that's 3 or 4 months from now, that I think there too, at the end of the day, the decision will be made by Israelis based on how they feel about their leaders at home.
Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council and former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Daniel Shapiro. Ambassador, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. It's good to have you with us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.